meeting starts, Pam, just make sure you look up your voting site because a lot of places have changed because of COVID.
Yes, I'm
Just
aware of that. And
just
they
confirm.
would, for early voting, they were going to send me to Madison Square, Madison Square Garden, to that site. But for the actual day of voting, it's the Sellis Manor.
And that's a public service announcement to everybody, is
Yeah.
just to reconfirm your voting locations, because a lot of places have changed this year because of COVID.
There you go. It's true. I will check again.
Tracking your ballot, Paul. That's a question.
Yeah, again, we're not launching the meeting yet. We're doing politics instead.
No,
the meeting is launched. Sorry, sorry. Just so we all know that we are recording in live. Push the button, but I can hear Paul say
sorry.
stop.
Sorry,
that's all right.
Okay, we better get down to business.
Yes, we'll get down to business, but Mike called me.
Business.
So we only have one item on our agenda, guys. Maybe we can be speedy. It's our budget request. And maybe I could sort of lead us off in that I look back at what people said at our last meeting when we talked a little bit about the budget. If you bear with me, I'll just tell you what some people recommended. We didn't make an official form that we filled out yet. But we had from KID a recommendation for a study to analyze the feasibility of repurposing empty buildings such as office and theaters to convert them to affordable housing. We had a suggestion from Viren, a comment from Viren that DCP is studying vacant housing due to people leaving the city, and that architecture schools were looking at retrofitting various types of buildings and malls. Is Viren on this meeting?
Yeah, he's here.
Okay. Bert suggested reuse for healthcare. And then Jesse raised who would do such studies. And then I guess Jesse or someone said DCP or EDC, and that we could write a letter on that if we wanted to have a collaborative planning effort. And Brad mentioned, I may have gotten this a little screwed up, the need for state funding for infrastructure such as sump pump at Fulton houses, which would be a capital expense. The other ones would be expense budget items. And Paul focused on 4 items, general items: security, education, housing, and health. And I've been involved with the Chelsea working group for the public housing in Chelsea. So this is not discussed at the last meeting. I have on my mind funding for apartment renovations and other infrastructure improvements for those projects. And then we have COVID-19 related opportunities to make budget requests. I've got some ideas about that, but rather than listen to myself, maybe we could open the discussion on mainly expense budget items and COVID-19 related items. Does anybody want to put their 2 cents in? Don't all speak at once.
Yeah, actually, I have a question. Betty, it's interesting that you brought up Fulton houses. What, as far as budget wise, what are we allowed to try to budget for? If I mean, how does that fit into the whole process? I'm just curious.
I don't know. I can't really answer that question. I just know that there's such a great need for funding of items that we've been living for the last year, gnashing our teeth and pulling our hair out to find ways that we can, sell air rights and do all kinds of exotic things to generate funding.
So
maybe Jesse can contribute on that.
Yeah, can I jump in there? So Hector, that's a great question. So historically, we've done, the board has really done their budget, getting budget information from two ways. One, from tenant associations, right? And literally just calling up the tenant associations for Fulton, Elliott, Chelsea, and Harborview and saying, what do you guys need, in either capital, or expense. And we've listed those historically in our budget. So it's not listed in it doesn't usually come through land use. It usually comes through housing. So it's not necessarily something I listed here. That's listed in your first, but if you look at the overall document, you can see from last year, we really did prioritize a number of the Fulton and Elliott, Chelsea, and Harborview requests, because we were, participating in the Chelsea, the Chelsea NYCHA working group so much, and wanted to make sure that we were advocating and, following through with what we've been saying in those meetings. But it's usually all capital. It's usually all pretty large, projects, whether it be something as simple as, when I say simple, as I just mean in the grand scheme of capital projects of replacing front doors, to the lights in front of Chelsea Elliott on 26th Street there, to the cameras, security cameras, to boilers, to roofs. So it can be almost anything related. We haven't historically done anything in expense in terms of direct staffing of a certain type of a staffing need or anything along those lines.
So can I, and also Hector, in a general response to your question, and this is for the benefit of everybody, and especially the newer people, what we are is in the beginning of the budget process for the next upcoming fiscal year budget decisions. So what we're doing now is the very early stages of what are the budget priorities from our community district, right? And we're taking a perspective from the land use committee. Are there things within the city budget that we think need to be beefed up, whether it's an ongoing expense or a capital expense? And then that will go to a budget task force, which will then get sifted out. And then the entire community board will prioritize our budget needs for the upcoming fiscal year. So we're in the early stages of like a dream list kind of creation. And as Jesse and Betty have pointed out, a lot of the stuff at NYCHA, the capital expenses aren't necessarily from land use, but they would probably come more from housing. But if we can, to help get our thought train running with ideas of what we want for land use priorities.
Okay. So I guess my next question as a follow-up would be, I'm glad to hear we're still in the beginning process of thinking about what's going to go into the budget requests, proposals. At what point do we reach out? I mean, do we reach out to the TAs of all the housing of all the NYCHA locations, or
Yeah,
Harborview,
Hector,
Chelsea?
that's on my list to do. So I historically done that. I just reach out to
Miguel
and
Miguel and Darlene, right?
And Darlene,
right.
And I produce a report. I don't want to call it a report. It's not. It doesn't suffice as a report. It's a piece of paper that says this is what they report. This is what they said that they need, and I provide that to the to the housing task force. I'm not the housing task force. I'm sorry, the budget task force. It's always been a little. I will say, Hector, actually, this is not necessarily something that this is clue focused, but I do think getting more input from NYCHA residents and from NYCHA itself earlier on in the process has always been, I think, a struggle for us. And so it sort of has fallen into this my responsibility of just sort of getting having a phone call with the TA presidents. But I think if there's some way to include it more into the housing conversation earlier on, I think that would be something to have. I think that'd be helpful. And so maybe we can follow up with Maria and maybe the TAs and Joe and have a conversation about how we can sort of make that a yearly thing. because it just doesn't, unfortunately.
I
Happen.
would also,
Okay, that sounds great. I guess I'd like to help along with the process because obviously I have a stake in both Elliott, Chelsea, and Fulton. So, and I kind of know all the players involved. So if anything, if anything I could do, I'd be more than happy to facilitate, get this, get the ball rolling on some of this stuff.
Elzora, did you want to say something? You looked like you were about to say something.
I was gonna do the same because we do have 3 members of the Chelsea Land Use Committee on the NYCHA working group.
And one of them has his hand up.
I don't see your hand, sorry.
Mike's hand is up. Yeah, I see it.
I don't see it. So yeah, so Mike, that's perfect because I want to think if the NYCHA working group has any land use perspective items that are coming out that maybe housing will address something on the budget priority from the NYCHA working group, but we as land use perspective, is there anything that we need to address?
Michael, did you want to say something?
Well, I did, and I can say that, just as in the past, we really haven't ever had anything strictly from a land use perspective to comment on. But we did add stuff to the budget, the capital request.
Well, no, we have.
So one of them this year that I think we cannot, stop asking for is, to redo the elevators in this building, in the Elliott buildings. Elevators are a catastrophe here every now and then. We got people that are disabled, can't use the elevators. It's on and off. It's all the time on and off, So that's one thing we should, do again. That's about it.
Suppose we put a sort of a holding spot or until Jesse polls the tenant leaders. Improve funding for improvement of infrastructure for the public housing projects, particularly redoing the elevators, plus other parts of the projects that, based on tenant feedback, that Jesse will get. Could we make some sort of general statement like that? Would that be kosher?
Would it be more impactful if we just focused on elevator maintenance and repair? That's probably the single biggest budget expense that any building faces, aside from a boiler replacement or a roof replacement. Elevator maintenance is the priciest thing on the book.
I do know from the conversations of the working group that the heating system, and Hector and Elzora, you could correct me, that the heating system would need to be replaced.
In which building? We're talking all of Fulton?
In all of them, actually. It's a major issue.
So
we could put elevators and heating systems.
That's basically the guts of your building.
Yeah, pretty much. Yes.
Whoa.
And it's a huge expense involved.
It's a big expense.
Yeah. So if we bulleted and everybody in different committees all said, do the elevators, get funding for your elevators and do the elevators.
I guess if
the funding for elevators, let me just say something.
Yeah.
Full disclosure. Employees of the Housing Authority are my clients. Many of them are, but the elevator maintenance people. And for example, it's also an expense item because there are, like, right now, 45, I think it's something like 45 or 46 unfunded elevator helper positions. The Housing Authority is not filling those positions and using laborers to help the elevator mechanics, which is completely unsafe.
It's a nightmare.
It's a nightmare. So if we're talking elevators, there's capital, but there's also expense items. And they're not even using the expense what they're budgeted to use, they're not using it for whatever reason.
So how does that affect what decisions we make about what
Well, we're
items
talking
to
about
support?
elevator maintenance, and I think part of that is the staff that the housing authority is using to maintain the elevators.
How do we impact that? If
It's an
that's what we
expense-
want to do. I mean, we're
Okay,
talking
it's
budget here, so.
It's in the expense budget. One, to use all the positions that they have already in the budget, which they're not using. And to use trained people in that elevator maintenance department, not laborers, which they have to use the laborers, they have to do a very quick couple of weeks training for the laborers to know which is the door and which is top and which is the bottom of the elevator.
Ah,
Wow, that you really know this, Bert.
Well, they're my clients.
I was gonna say, is there data that tells you which of the positions are not filled?
I just happened today came across something from the union
Thank you.
about that with the elevator maintenance helpers.
So it sounds like we could fine tune this recommendation. What do you think, Paul?
Yeah, I think putting it both in capital and in ongoing expenses.
Okay, so we can do that both. And Bert, you've given us some valuable information. Is there anything that you have in writing that you could share with us that we could make
I
it a
will.
more meaningful statement?
I'll
And
get
for-
numbers that from what I saw this afternoon, and I'll email it to you.
Okay.
And Bert, you're familiar with the language that we need in these forms anyway, so that'd be great. Jesse has something to add though.
Yeah, I just, two things that I just wanted, one, just a little bit clarify what Paul had said earlier, that at the beginning of the process, it is at the beginning of the process in the sense of like, we're talking about FY22 and we're just in the beginning of FY21. But in terms of our actual process, we're voting on these recommendations in November's full board. So we've had the last 2 months to negotiate, talk about these. From a committee perspective, each committees have been discussing them in their own different fashion. And so what you're voting on tonight is what you're recommending to the budget task force. Now, Bert knows, and I'm quickly checking around the room. I don't think anybody else on this call, but Bert knows for sure, right? That then the budget task force's job is to try to combine all of these
we
from all the
juggle.
different committees. Yeah, and juggle them. So I just don't want to give people I don't want to give people the impression that tonight you will be voting on it. So and then the other thing is it's your prerogative, of course, as committee, as a committee, but I just want to, historically, what you're voting on as budget requests have been things that the committee itself has been on record for, working on and either sent a previous letter about or has had a discussion about. And so I'm just raising that as things that if we're bringing in new information, necessarily, not to say that it doesn't require a priority. I'm just saying that you have existing stuff that you voted, that you've been recommending for years on that are on your list that I think at some point tonight you should go through and decide whether where that all falls out, if it's still relevant, if it's not relevant, however you feel about it. But I just want to give that historical.
That's interesting, Jesse, because I've been thinking about it today and talking to Paul, that I think a number of the things that I looked at them again for the third time, like things about zoning and code enforcement and all that kind of stuff. I personally think that at this point in the city's economic situation, that those things don't feel to me to be high priority. Those ones that we've had on our lists, for a long time, and that we may want to try to generate some new recommendations more relevant to our situation in the city. I don't know how everybody else feels, but I just feel that, expanding a zoning district or upping code enforcement will not be, I think that those kinds of items would be very low priority in this city, and that there may be other things, given COVID-19 and the economic downturn, that would be more relevant. So,
Yeah,
Viren, did
I agree
you?
with Betty 100%. You know, as far as priorities go, I mean, it's quality of life issues that we really should be addressing at this point. And I think, yeah, we should introduce some new ideas on this budget if we can at this point. I don't know, and maybe it's late in the game, but I don't know what the process might be, but that might be something we maybe seriously consider.
I was going to ask Viren, I kind of, today was awfully late notice to send you an email, but that you had been talking at the last meeting about retrofitting or converting buildings that are underused or empty into other land uses, which I thought is very relevant at this point, or it could be relevant, and that we could request funding for certain studies along those lines. And you think that maybe architecture schools are looking at that already?
Architecture schools are looking at that actually even before COVID struck, for a variety of reasons. So New York City is known to have pretty high, vacancy rate, irrespective of what happened with the pandemic. But because of the pandemic, I think the vacancy rate in housing, in apartments, is 13.3% now, and that's the data that actually is generally collected by HPD and real estate, brokerage companies. So that number does exist, and that's sort of fairly accurate. For office buildings, the vacancy is not high, but the buildings are empty. The office spaces are empty because only 10% of the workforce is actually showing up to work. So that's the finding of my students that actually reached out to a number of different property owners who actually have large tenants. So no large tenants have left any of these office spaces, so to speak, and Paul can probably qualify my statement a bit more. They haven't left, but they're not being used fully. So that's where we are. So there's emptiness, but it's not considered to be vacancy. That's the distinction that they're making. Housing vacancy is real, and rents are falling is real. So that sort of, is sort of known. Even New York Times wrote an article about it. And going back to the schools looking at vacant buildings and adaptive reuse, that's been going on for the last couple of years, mainly because across the board, there is a pretty large percentage of old buildings that are not exactly conducive to any kind of particular use right away unless you retrofit them. So schools are looking at those kind of buildings. And last but not the least, you might have read about Industry City proposal being pulled back, meaning they withdrew that because it wasn't going to be approved. There was a big community pushback. And in the process, the whole project is actually withdrawn. Not rejected, it's withdrawn. But that's an important fact to know because while we say that—
Viren, could you just pause for a second? What was withdrawn?
Sunset Park, the Industry City, those 3 or 4 buildings that were to be converted for adaptive reuse, and all kind of cool stuff was going to come up there. Offices, incubators, startups, food places, food production places actually, restaurants and bars. It was a very large, ambitious project that was supposed to kind of bring the economic change to the community, but there was a pushback because of its perceived threat for gentrification, which has happened in Williamsburg. It is happening in Brooklyn Navy Yards and around there. I mean, the fact that the Wagman shows up next to Brooklyn Navy Yards tells you the story. So the community had a major pushback. That's the project that's been withdrawn. The developer withdrew that proposal that was sitting in front of city planning.
Well, I mean, I guess the question would be, would we want to make a recommendation for some kind of funding, which would be an expense item, for some kind of study along the lines of what we're talking about? And so, you know, could be DCP, EDC, DHS, HPD, some collaborative effort, because it seems there's, I mean, we're just a group of people. We don't know exactly what's going on. You know, we just sort of know what's going on. And would that be a meaningful request?
It could be. For office spaces, I'm not sure yet because there isn't enough data to suggest that it's warranted. It is probably happening for smaller office spaces. WeWork is a very particular circumstance. I mean, their situation is entirely different compared to the large sort of lease, you know, the companies that lease large spaces. For example, you know, post office is being leased by Facebook now. I don't know who's going to actually work there, but they actually at least leasing that space. So though it is empty, it is not considered to be vacant. I'm just giving you a very jarring example in our own neighborhood, right?
There is though, in a lot of the large corporations, you know, I don't know exactly who, but there's a lot of sublease space now coming on the market, which means the large company is not giving up their space, but they're trying to see if they can sublease a part of the space. This is only recently, in the last month or 2 months, it's now been on the market. And I only know this because, not that I'm a broker, but I read it in the Times.
No, it is true. I think people are doing that. People are retrofitting existing spaces to reduce the number of people who can actually occupy those spaces. So the reduction is, so that kind of planning is happening. But if you ask me, technically speaking, does that qualify as vacancy rate? No, for offices. For housing related, we could request that kind of a study through HPD because they are actually the keepers of how the vacancy and because that affects their sort of, what do you call it, their mandate in terms of rent stabilization and rent control issues. EDC would come into play when we talk about Industry City or some other large spaces that are being converted. So EDC might be potentially an agency that could help us understand the issue of office space vacancy. But there's no city agency that's keeping that because they basically saying that's all commercial, that's not our problem.
And hey, Viren, what word would you use instead of, because I should point out, it's not technically a vacancy. What's another word we could use there?
The buildings are empty. They use the word empty. They call them empty buildings.
Just empty?
Empty spaces, yes.
Empty spaces, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
What they say, sorry, I'm just going to qualify that a little more. They say only 10% of the leased spaces are occupied. Right.
So it's not technically a vacancy because the companies are still paying the rent or the lease, but there's emptiness. So that's I want to make sure we're clear on that distinction.
They're not giving up the space.
Yeah.
They will be coming back. There was something in today's paper. Next July is the
yeah, I read that.
January. Next July will be the new January. But the question is not that they're not going to come back. Chase is putting up a whole new building on Park Avenue, complete new headquarters. The question is, how are they going to use the building when it's finished differently than when they planned it originally, pre-pandemic? Now, how are these companies coming back? How will they be using the space post-pandemic as opposed to pre-pandemic? They might be not as many people in the offices. The square footage may be the same, but the number of people will be different, which then will affect the subsidy, not the what's the word? the other, like the retail around the corner and the lunch spaces, because they
You know,
won't.
like the local businesses, there would be less people, you mean,
I mean, this
to
is,
shop.
it reverberates.
Mhm.
There's
So
a-
it sounds to me like maybe if we wanted to go down this road, that we might recommend two different kinds of study, one about residential issues and one about industrial, commercial, office building uses. Two different, seems like they're apples and oranges. If that's where, if we want to go down that kind of a route.
They're two different things, and I agree with you, Betty. As an advisory group, our focus seems to be, generally speaking, housing much more than office space, by and large. I'm just saying, as a community, that's what we sort of concern ourselves with. The discussion that we had last month was potentially converting office spaces into residential. We are not there yet, and that's the sort of reading that I get. Nobody's there yet. There's a request for 5% reduction of the large leased spaces, but there's no wholesale walking away or vacating those premises. So that's where the distinction needs to be made. So there's no way we can discuss converting office spaces into affordable housing, because that point is at least about, I would say, in my opinion, personally, it's at least about a year away from today. So maybe next October, November, there
Well,
might
this,
be.
this budget is then too. Hey, Brad, did I see your hand go up?
Yeah, I'm just trying to wrap my hands around what somebody said originally was, we understand where the city's finances are. This is something we talked about on the other board I was on with the parks. And I'm kind of with our chair, co-chair of, let's aim small, shoot small, right? I mean, I think we should be very specific. We're asking for a big study. We're not gonna get any of this. This is a pie in the sky. They're not gonna spend money on doing a study. Scott Stringer's office has done one. The Manhattan Borough President has turned out studies after studies of what they're gonna do with the open retail, the open office space. Last week we were presented at our big board of all the incentives that Scott Stringer's office is trying to do to help them get money to reuse these spaces. I don't know. I just think maybe we could really just focus on one or two items. This is just my opinion. I think we're getting very brave.
What items?
These are all great things to say, but unless they do it for free, which we could advocate through our office, but I just don't think sending this to the city right now in any shape or form is even going to get looked at, in my opinion.
That's a good point. Are there some specific items that you would recommend, Bert? Brad?
No, yeah, sure.
Bert's right above you in the box.
Yeah, I'm all for being very specific about affordable housing that we have now and letting people get on an elevator. I think mechanically, doing mechanical upgrades, that's a whole other wax that I don't think we're involved with. But to say to the city, let's put some money towards having maintenance on an elevator, I think is a realistic ask because it's safety. I mean, I have no problem with that one.
I think we got that one
Absolutely.
nailed.
I agree with Brad. I really agree with Brad on that we should stay focused on what we are best known for, which is our search for affordable housing. And as far as I'm concerned, safety and elevators. I don't know how many elevators there are in Fulton houses. It's a number I'd like to know. But that's something that we could definitely focus on and have some impact.
And then the second one, which I would say is, which I happen to enjoy, is we do approve these sidewalk cafe. So I'm for looking at, obviously we want to say we want them to help the businesses, but I like the idea going forward, a more permanent. I think it adds a lot to the city, in my opinion. So I don't know if we want to weigh in on something like that, I know they just announced that they could have their heaters and the rest of it, but maybe we should say as a community, we are advocating for them taking the sidewalk space and maybe taking some street space. Just a thought.
Brad, that coming up with transportation committee, which I'm sort of part of, so I can tell you that that's actually being taken up. And I think one more suggestion, which is sort of right now floating, not sort of put in place yet, is that city also should gain something from it. So it's not, because you actually are creating different types of conflicts. So when the public space is being used for private gain, what does city get out of it? And what does the community get out of it? Besides,
well, I think one, it killed me at the last meeting when our representatives sat there and said their answer to everything is more tax. I don't know where they're thinking of where this money just happens to come. And people that make that top echelon money, they're leaving. You can't, it's crazy to me. What we're gaining is people working, and our neighborhood is gaining, they have somewhere to go. I mean, that's just how I see what we're gaining. We're also gaining some city life that we haven't seen in a long time, of a Chase and a Rite Aid on every corner. We're starting to me, see a bit more community that we didn't have before. As a positive thing. That's just, that's how I see it. I think that's what we're gaining. We're gaining our communities back. We're gaining shutting streets off. And I understand transportation has it in their agenda, but we're the ones that approve it.
Yeah.
So
there are a couple of good things there. Also, some places in Chelsea, particularly, even in Hell's Kitchen, actually, the sidewalks need to be expanded. And now is the time to reclaim piece of the city that we can actually, make permanent. So, I mean, there are a lot of good ideas on the table, and it doesn't matter which committee does it. But as a community board, I think a kind of clear agenda as to how we want the street space reshaped moving forward. So there's more room for the pedestrians and more amenities for the community, including outdoor dining and whatever else that follows. Absolutely. I think that's where we are. I think we are in a very good place, irrespective of all the terrible things that we've seen. There is real understanding of how communities can reclaim the city.
And that can be done because I grew up in Chicago, where they give permits based on where you live for a 5-block radius around your house. That eliminated all the other parking problems they had. And it really reduced and forced people in the outer boroughs or taking the train or parking in Jersey.
All right, that's certainly a transportation committee issue.
Yes, it is. So
I'm
for two things.
Let's try to refocus here, guys.
One quick thing, Paul, before we move away from who does what kind of study. I believe Stringer's office actually typically looks at retail vacancy issues more than any other city agency. And that I forgot to mention before. So we could probably just simply, it could be a matter of writing a letter to Stringer's office. They typically do that every couple of years. And I'm sure they're working on it. I just don't have a way of knowing. So we can inquire that is there something being done.
But I also think, Veron, the important thing for us is the difference between vacancy and emptiness.
Yes.
Because vacancy reports aren't going to address the land use issues that we're trying to tackle. So as Bert points out, less less occupants of these large office buildings, a lower percentage, because people will need more space inside of them post-COVID, means less people on the streets, less impact, greater impact on local retailers. So
no, I have to correct you one more time. Less people in the offices means you're incentivizing people to move out of the city as well. So they're the kind of, it's a circular loop. I mean, you know what I'm trying to say. So it is already prompting people to leave the city because there's no reason for them to come here.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, exactly. And I think, as Brad points out, we're seeing more community now. I know that when I walk around Chelsea and Hell's Kitchen and I pass by the sidewalk cafes, it ain't a bunch of people from Nebraska anymore. It's people from New York who are out on the streets. So let's, Betty, do you want to recap then what we're going to actually vote on?
Well, I don't know if we're ready. I don't know if we're ready to do that. I mean, I think we have gotten two solid things. One is funding for the repair of elevators in our public housing projects and the correct and appropriate staffing of filling the spaces, the slots for the positions for skilled elevator staff or engineers. So that's one thing. And if we follow up on Brad's idea, funding, I mean, we have to always talk about money because it's a budget. So funding to support sidewalk cafes, and that's as far as I could get. And it seemed that, I don't know whether we have a consensus about asking for money for studies. Maybe that's unrealistic and we shouldn't do that.
I have one tiny item to bring up having to do with open streets, which is budgeting for the expenses that are presently being borne by individuals and the block associations to maintain the barriers, replace them when they get wrecked, and purchase the signage that's needed to mount on those barriers.
Is that something, Viren, is that something that sounds like transportation is tackling? I know that when I was on that committee, we talked about that a lot.
Yeah, I think it's going to be one of the sort of
Yeah,
budget items.
Pam, I think that's a transportation issue.
I'll make it,
Okay,
make
I've
it a point
written,
to take it to them. If it's not that,
I mean,
Okay.
look, we
I'd
can.
like
open
that
up. I mean,
to be introduced,
we can,
because-
it's all going to get smooshed together by the budget committee. I mean, I feel attached to that item, Pam, because I'm in a church who's responsible for Thompson Street in the village. And yes, you know.
you're aware that it is not without cost to maintain.
Yes, I'm
we
aware,
have
and our
20
church doesn't
It's all
have
over the
an
place,
overflow of money,
I
right?
have 22nd Street between 7th and 8th in my block association, which is an open street and has been for several months. We've spent beyond $250 just to equip the barriers, to get the barriers, the appropriate barriers, not the big wooden jobs, and also the signage. It's going to become an issue of manpower to set up the barriers and in the mornings and remove them in the evenings, because we can't hope to rely on our local citizens to step forward voluntarily and do that. Presently, we have that and we're okay, but it can't last, and that needs to be considered as well. Some
Yeah,
sort of
that was part of the selling point of the open streets, though, is that the bids and the residents would take care of it. That's how it got through the process. But
well, the bids, okay, those guys get paid for what they do.
No, but it was bids
know.
and block associations, both. And but I see your point that if we can get city funding for that, it would be better to make that request. So.
It would be more reliable, for sure.
Well, it's not just bids. I mean, you know, a church and a
Anybody,
block association are in much different financial consideration.
Exactly.
Than those, a bid, you know. So.
I mean, if we want this whole concept to be successful, it needs to be reliable. So
anyway, I particularly like that. I'm, you know,
Thank you.
You know, even if it is a transportation issue, you know, it's land use in the sense that we, the citizens, are using these spaces and we want them to be successful. And it's actually a land use in that it's taking property and using it in a different way.
Yeah, and the impact is on the quality of life, which is something we can certainly address.
So very creative, I think. How about some other ideas? Any other ideas?
So I do want to also point out that
I have another idea. If you want ideas, I got a lot of ideas. I think.
Where were
I've
you?
said it a lot of times. We are an island. we should think Dutch. We should be thinking land use is water. We should be utilizing our waterfront, not just for a beautiful park. We need to be, it could be a floating farm. We need to be thinking about land use out towards the water. It's just my opinion.
I thought you were
We're not going to get it during the pandemic, but maybe we could use a farm or a floating hotel that could help the homeless, something.
I thought you were going to talk about a building code that would allow for drone deliveries, Brad.
Brad,
No.
come to my studio if you really want to talk about floating farms.
Love the floating farms.
My studio is looking at PS 76, believe it or not.
So
Yeah, we brought it up at the other meeting, but to me, that's still a land use issue.
It is. It is.
It is, and if we, and you know, I'm conflicted with the notion of putting forward these priorities and also having budget constraints and being realistic, Brad, as you recognize. Floating farms and floating homeless shelters is a grand scheme. I think when we have a stronger budget, let's talk about that. On the other side of it, I have been talked to by a number of people that when we talk about budget priorities, last meeting I said, let's just wipe them all out. And I was told that if we don't keep our priorities in place from previous years, they won't be, it'll be hard to get them back in again in future years. So to keep our the other things that were in the budget requests from last year, such as code enforcement issues, department building issues, land use on neighborhood needs, things like that, that we keep them in there, but we recognize they're not going to be a high priority.
Placeholders.
Exactly. So Brad, let's talk about water farms next year.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, we could, I mean, it's all on our list. We can, put them back, keep them going, I guess. Viren?
Can I bring up one more issue? It's housing related, and it's been sort of, tossed around quite a lot. We had a building on West 18th Street, residential building, that was supposed to be mass timber.
Supposed to be what?
Mass timber. It was a timber construction, timber frame high rise. And that was basically pulled out because city will not approve it, and all of that is happening. The city is now a little more sympathetic to it. So I'm not going to get into that particular project alone, but decarbonization in our community should be taken into account when we actually when we start looking at new proposals and new buildings. We keep doing steel frame and concrete buildings all the time because that's how the industry is set up. But encouraging alternative materials such as mass timber, there are many others, should be something that we should be able to have a say in. This community actually has, this came to my mind when we were actually looking at terminal stores, the timber frame building, and then we're putting steel thing on top of it. And the justification was mainly because city will not approve timber construction from FAR code point of view. But mass timber actually does deal with FAR code as well, and David can actually sort of testify to that as well. So I think we should try and, I'm not saying that we should make the entire neighborhood timber frame, but for newer projects coming up, decarbonization should be put on the agenda. Sustainability should be put on the agenda. Water harvesting should be put on the agenda. Solar panels should be put on the agenda. Geothermal should be put on the agenda. These are the things, we're still talking about, we're using 20th century tools, and we are 20 years into 21st century. So I think some of these items need to be sort of woven into how our approval processes are shaped moving forward. I don't know how we do it, but there should be some mechanism in place.
But we're talking about the budget right now. So is there a way for what you want to be described as a budget ask?
Not quite
Well,
sure.
one way would be
An
if a big
examination
new
of what
development.
we have, the building codes? Would this be looking
Yeah, I
at
was
the?
going to say, if there's a URLIP, Bert, where it's, they're trying to change or upzone, that could be something that we could say, could there be put money in the budget to have a category for sustainable material, or our big one, environmental, is what they're doing with their garbage. And, I don't think that's, I think it's a pretty good idea. But for budget wise, we could say, can we get some money in the city planning to add it into their application? Just one idea. Because you're not going to get it on a townhouse renovation. You're going to get it out of something like Hudson Yards, right?
Yeah.
So it's going to be at a bigger scale.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know which budget item it would serve. I don't know the line item, how we can describe it, but sustainability guidelines, how they actually get woven into city's approval process. Maybe there's something that we can ask DOB and DCP to come up with jointly, because one makes the one makes the regulation, the other one enforces it. So the two agencies should probably come together and find a way of making sure these things happen.
My understanding is that for that 18th Street Mass Timber building, it was to be where La Luncheonette was, that the city was working with the developer on that, and, was open to accepting it and looking at ways that the timber framing could meet the equivalent of the building code. And I know they got a good ways down the road with it. And I think at some point the developer just decided it was too complicated and backed out. I don't think it was reluctance on the part of the city at that.
No. I didn't say that. I was saying that they pulled it out. They pulled out of the whole thing. Sorry.
Viren, going back to Bert's point about the budget issues, I think you're raising a very valid point, a very valid concern. And maybe what we do is try to tackle it at one of our meetings and come up with a letter to the appropriate agencies to change policy, right? And direct it in that way. Instead of having it be a part of a budget discussion, let's have a policy discussion about it.
No, I agree with you, Paul. I think that's what I was about to say. I don't know which line item it fits into, but it's a discussion that we can have as a conversation with our next meeting or something.
Yeah, I think that let's do that. Let's take that approach on that one.
Sure.
Let's try to figure out a letter we want to write to the appropriate agency to work at policy change to improve sustainability and bring us into the 21st century in our construction and engineering projects.
So I have a suggestion on a practical level, because I'm practical minded. What if we approach the concept of having a study? I know we're not talking about spending money on studies, but this one would be very sensible, in Chelsea, and this research should be doable. All of the buildings that burn fossil fuel, either oil, number 4 or number 2 oil, or natural gas for heating, for their heating systems, and do a study about how many of those boilers, what their ages are when they're reaching the end of their age, of their usefulness, at about 40 years or 50 years. Some of them last that long. That there should be some way to require the building owners to replace those devices with sustainable heating systems. That would be a study worth doing. Then you could have real impact on the sustainability in the future going forward, either converting to electricity or geothermal or solar or a combination of all those things. It's worth talking about. To Viren's point about sustainability.
Yeah, again, that's not really a budget issue for us this week.
It would be if it was to finance, if you were asking for the financing of a study to give us the information we would need.
Okay, I can frame any policy discussion as a study and get the money for it.
There you go. I know it's a stretch, but
let's try to like hone in a little bit here on our capital and expense line items for fiscal year 2022 and what we can get accomplished as
okay.
And I think these are healthy conversations to have, and we should have an agenda item at a meeting to talk about how we can tackle sustainability in the city and figure out ways to do that. I don't think this is the right format for that.
Okay.
It is very interesting, Pam.
I love it. And listen, I can go off on that, but I'm not going to because I'm asking other people not to.
So why don't we just go back to the placeholder concept? And it seemed to me that code enforcement, expanding and reinforcing code enforcement and DOB enforcement, particularly for our special districts and in our special districts, are a focus for keeping the placeholders.
So let me ask this. Everybody got the Dropbox link to the spreadsheet that lists last year's spending priorities, right, Jesse? Is that just nod,
Looks
yes
like
or no?
this, like
Yeah.
this.
So, I mean, if we just want to agree as a committee, we'll just leave any ongoing budget line items in there as placeholders. Can we have an agreement, yes or no on that? So those in favor of keeping all last year's placeholders in place?
I,
Can I only make
Cost anything.
Jesse's
make
got a point.
caveat to that is that you, as reported by the agency, I am not saying that, you know, the problem is solved, but you did get something funded last year. So one of the expense items was listed as being funded. So I would just say, if that's okay, we could either move to continued support level, which is sort of a rank below, or just remove it completely and saying, thank you, we're
Yes.
done.
I would agree. I'd agree with that. Is everybody else okay with that?
There's now just if you look at the chart, you'll see that, for instance, code enforcement has specific topics of code enforcement. So one has to do with dedicated inspector for special district enforcement. And the answer was, the agency agrees with this request, will accommodate in part. Another one was code enforcement, additional funding for buildings department, enforcement inspectors for non-compliant ADA entrances. And it says the department has increased the number of inspectors citywide. That's just, you know, and then there's a number of other ones. Now here's a study, so we could skip, since we're
But we
not.
can, but Betty, you and I, if the committee's in agreement that we're going to keep the budget priorities from last year, and as Jesse points out, anything that is continued funding, we'll leave on. Anything else we can take up, we'll just clean up the actual list. But as long as everybody agrees that we keep those placeholders in place, that's our first.
But
step.
do we keep in place things like modify the special permit process of off-street parking? That's of a different nature. Do we want to keep that in?
I think that the committee just said anything that was in previous years as a placeholder that needs, we're just going to recognize it's a placeholder. It's going to be a low priority, but we're going to keep everything in from last year that wasn't funded or isn't continuing, you know, like as Jesse pointed out, we'll clean out the list, but everything else stays as a placeholder.
I think, Betty, you said you'd had meetings with DCP and they were amenable to doing that. This has to do with luxury high rises going in along the High Line where they asked to exceed the 20% parking spaces to.
You know how long ago we had a meeting with DCP about that? I couldn't even tell you how long ago.
Yeah, no, we tried this year at the beginning of the year, David, to try to actually, because every year they go, we want to talk to you about this, please follow up. And, you know, and it always gets sort of pushed to the back because there's always a ULERP that pops up or something else pops up. And so this, at the end of 2019 and through into the beginning of 2020, I actually was chasing down DCP to follow up on this issue because they're still not doing what we want them to do, basically. And
well, it's still a valid issue. I think we should leave it on there for
I
better
agree with
days.
you. I agree with you because I don't think
we've just voted
we're
to do
actually
that.
where we want to be. I just think, like what Paul said, I think is we have to recognize that whatever I think you guys are discussing right now, the top priorities to the 1, 2, 3, the things that you want to send to the budget task force to say this is the most important. Last year's priorities are still important, but we recognize that those are all going to sort of be shifted down on the
Right.
list.
And, you know, I have to say with regard to Brad's suggestion about use of the streets for restaurants, that's topical because it's a demonstration project. You know, sometimes the city will do things like close streets like they do Park Avenue in the summer on weekends to give people a glimpse of what it would be like if people could, pedestrians and cyclists could take back the streets. We have that happening by accident on a huge scale now. So, you know, I think it's good to strike while the iron is hot in this case. So to me, even though it seems more quality of life than something urgent, in terms of looking ahead to the long term and making it a permanent sort of thing, you know, this is the time to do it simply because of practical reasons.
So we have two new things as I see it. Well, we've got the restaurants, the outdoor dining, okay. And we've got the elevators, okay. We've got the outdoor dining and we've got the elevators at Fulton and Chelsea Elliott. And we don't want to propose studies.
And I think, and Betty, what I would suggest we do to pull in Pam's point about open street funding for the citywide level is on the restaurants, a lot of them also happen to be on open streets. So let's find a way of incorporating the language together in there.
Do you think it should be combined?
I mean, I think it's a more logical way of getting the funding for that is to put it in with the small business appeal. Because a lot of these, like I know a lot of the streets that have restaurants are pretty much closed off to cars now. Not all of them, but there's some, and that's a good way to get about tying these together.
Okay, I guess we could. I think it's a little apples and oranges, but I guess we could do it that way. So we have 2.5 new things that we would say. Are we happy with that list of new things? There no other new things that want to be brought up? So I guess that's it then. We have these 2.5, and then we've got recycling our old proposals. Are we good on that?
Sounds right.
Yeah, that seems what we've arrived at with consensus.
Jesse, are we on the right path?
Yeah, so as long as you and Paul work on it together afterwards and submit something to the budget task force that it clarifies the ranking, right, of what they are, who you want, what agency you're expecting the request to go to, and if it's whether it's capital or expense, that's fine. That's completely fine.
And do we have to use table 1, table 2, and table 3?
I think it'd be easier for you guys for that because you can just add your new, I'm assuming the 2.5 will be the first 3, right?
Yes.
Priorities 1, 2, and 3. And then the others you'll just rank, roll down, or turn them into continued support or just say remove because it's been funded, whichever one you want to do.
Okay.
And so then that's fine. And I think it sounds like what you guys done is actually combine table 2 and 3 into sort of one.
Yeah, because our top priority ones that we just talked about are related to the pandemic.
Right. And I'll just say one other thing. I think there's nothing, I think you don't necessarily, committees have tried very hard not to sort of like go into the scope of another committee in terms of recommendations, but that doesn't mean you guys can't, or the co-chairs of this committee, or maybe through Bert at the budget task force, say that we recognize there's these issues that are sort of go beyond what our normal sphere is, and we think these are really important. So we're going to back up, the transportation related things, or the I will say a lot of the street stuff, just so we're all clear. I mean, but they all go in front of more in front of BLP. Like a lot of the future, they used to go all the restaurant stuff goes in front of BLP, and so just I think that's something to be aware of as well. So, but yeah, that's fine. So as long as you guys vote and you're all contingent of I apologize just because there was what the 2.5 things are again, Betty?
The outdoor dining for restaurants, the city streets, which could be a subset of that or separate.
Call that
And-
open streets.
I mean, it's open streets, sorry, that's what I meant. And the repair of elevators in the public housing projects, which would include staffing up with appropriate engineers and filling the lines that need to be filled.
Yeah, there'll be 2 requests, and one capital improvement and one operating expense.
Right,
Yeah.
okay.
You know, when there
Capital
was,
And
the
just so I understand, and I don't want to start us off, I mean, I apologize if this opens up a whole nother can of worms, but are we prioritizing in that way? Are you saying, because
I
that
think you
matters
need
to the
to-
budget task force,
You
I
should
will
put the
say.
elevators first.
Well, the elevators are.
Everybody,
capital.
everybody
So-
in favor of elevators first, raise your hand.
There we go.
Okay.
Fine.
All right, elevators are before restaurants and dining, great.
And we,
I
as
would just ask if we
Unless-
want to include boilers and roofs in that though, because, you know, when it was written about in the New York Times, what bad shape Fulton House was in, you know, those were mentioned as well as major problems.
David, these are the 3 sort of major ticket items. You got elevators, you got boilers, and you got the roofs. These are the three items that are killing nature.
Yeah.
So it's
Mhm.
practically
Okay.
everything except for the brick, which is the last, not last, the
Amazing.
4th item.
And-
Not
and-
to mention the
Jesse, can
plumbing,
I-
the hot and cold water lines and the risers and the
Jesse, can I,
waste vent
can I,
stack.
can I ask Jesse or Elzora Betty, is the NYCHA working group putting together a budget request as part of our community board budget process?
No, I don't think so.
So it does have to come through housing and us and whatnot. Okay, all right, no,
So
So-
just so I just want to create what usually happens here is that things like the roofs and the boilers and the elevators, and I am not defending NYCHA here at this point, but that's their big ticket items. You're all right about it, and that's what they tell us that they're focused on fixing, right? So then every year, that's why we go to the TAs, because if we say the boilers and the roofs and the elevators, their response is going to say, yeah, we're working on it, right? And so that one of the reasons why we historically have gone to the tenant associations is because there's other things, there's other quality of life and public safety things that sort of get pushed to the bottom or ignored by NYCHA that we do. So I just want to be prepared that there will be a sort of if you look at what our NYCHA requests are in the past, even last year, you know, there were things like front doors, cameras, you know, new lobbies, those types of things, because those are the things that the TA have communicated to us. So I'm not trying to get involved. I'm not trying to impede this conversation and say that the items that you guys discuss aren't important, but I just want us to be aware that there'll be another set of information coming in from the TAs that will most likely say, yes, those are obviously all big ones, but we know NYCHA is already going to be focusing on those.
Yeah.
What we want to advocate for is, you know, the lights in front of our playground that aren't being paid attention to, or the, you know, the things that haven't been, the trash compactor doors that haven't been. Hector has his hand up, so I'll defer
I mean, I
to an actual
I
TA person
appreciate that.
to tell me if I'm wrong or not.
yeah, Mike or Hector?
Yeah, actually, no, that's a really good point, Jesse. I mean, with the, you know, the time constraints, I mean, I was a little confused as to, I guess, the budget timing that we have here. I mean, are we having, this is the preliminary discussions, or are we about to vote tonight for the
Voting tonight.
budget items that we're going to put in today? Because honestly, because if we had the time, I would go back to the TA and
Yes.
both houses and ask them, you know, what would you like? You know, maybe the top 5, and then out of the top 5, we can all have a later discussion on it. But if time is an issue here, then obviously we would have to go with, you know, the top 3, which is really the heat, elevators, and I'm
So,
sorry, what was the other one?
Hector, can
I
I-
was saying,
security.
Hector, was
So,
just to clarify,
Yeah.
the budget task force is meeting on Thursday.
yeah,
So I usually reach out this week to get and are to check in with all of the TA presidents to say, this is what you requested last year. Is this still the same request? Do you want something new, or has things progressed? For example, I know there's certain things that Darlene has let me know have progressed, and so we have moved. If you notice how we did it last year with some of the Chelsea Elliott requests, we made them actually continued support because things have began to move on some of the issues that she had raised to us. And so how about you and me talk tomorrow, if that's all right?
Yeah, because I don't want to drag this out. I do understand that you've already got a process in place. So.
And so, but
Gotcha.
again, I think it speaks to a broader conversation about how we can get NYCHA more inclusive, or how we can be more inclusive with NYCHA going forward with our budget, because it's always been a bit of a kind of last minute type of quick call kind of thing, rather than a, maybe a more thorough conversation. So,
I would just like to clarify something, because earlier we said we wanted to be very focused and specific, so we talked about the elevators. And now it's being suggested that we add the boilers and the roofs. So I'm not sure if that direction is the way we want to go, because those are like very, very, very big items. And I thought we wanted to suggest something that was very doable.
Well, let me chime in on something here, okay? The reason why I left my comments only with respect to elevators is because things like, the boilers, the heat, hot water, the roof, facades, pointing up brick, those things are already being handled because there's an agreement with with HUD. And those things are covered already, so they're dealing with that. We've got constant surveillance of the hot water system here, heating system. The elevators are outside that.
Well, that's a good point.
They're outside that in that sense. We don't have people monitoring the number of breakdowns and that sort of thing, how long it takes to fix an elevator, how many times in a particular day has it gone down, that sort of thing. I'll tell you this much. The elevator crews that work on the elevators had been in the past, and probably are still today for a time being. They have to run around to different developments, far apart from each other. Now they're putting them into pods that are close by so that they travel a short distance. One of the crews is headquartered in my building here, 10th Avenue. So they don't have to run up to the Bronx or wherever anymore. They're all sticking close by. But the elevators are a serious issue here, serious. It took, and I worked on this, with even Greg Russ helped, when we first met. We got the compactor finally replaced here. Took 6 months or more, compactor. The elevators are something else. There's going to be a tragedy here. It's happened.
So it seems, Mike, that you're making a very good point. If the Fed are requiring work on the boilers and roofs, that maybe we should just focus on the elevators then.
Yeah, I would. I just leave it at that and let people know that really is an issue.
Okay.
All right, so we're going to keep it on just the elevators then. Can we have a quick show of hands on that? Is that good?
Yeah.
All right. And I think that's going to be then, we'll be able to call for a vote. There is somebody attending, a public member of the public member is attending. If that person wants to add anything to this conversation, if you just raise your hand, either, I think it's *9 to raise your hand if you're on a phone, or just hit the raise hand button. And if not, I'm going to call for a vote so we can wrap up this conversation, because I know a couple people are trying to get off this call. All right, I'm not seeing the hand go up. So is everybody good then with the priorities as described by Betty? Betty and I will work on getting them formatted onto the form to get to the Budget Task Force, which is meeting on Thursday. So we'll have to get it to them before then. And Bert is on the Budget Task Force, so he can clearly represent our viewpoints pretty strongly. Carrie, did you have something to say? I saw your screen light up.
I'm just ready to vote.
All right, excellent.
So am I.
All right. All in favor, then you can do a physical raise of hand. I'll be able to see almost everybody except for
Okay.
Carrie and Michael.
Aye.
Aye,
an aye.
Carrie.
Aye,
All right, seems unanimous.
thank you.
Okay,
All
great.
right, I think we're going to be able to wrap. I just wanted to make one other notification to everybody. The Flatiron bid was supposed to be on this month's agenda. We did not do it this month because we met with them. I had some meeting with them, and Jesse and Tina, I think we're all like a month ago or so. There was no real change to the bid proposal, so they're not coming forward yet. But when they do, they'll come back to us again. Just if anybody has any questions on that, you can reach out to me. I'll be happy to talk about it. All right.
Thank you, everybody. And I know
Thank
there was
you.
only one item on the agenda, but you came out and we got a quorum and that was very good.
Very productive. Thank you, everybody.
Good
Have a
night,
good
guys.
Thank you.
Good night,
Bye-bye.
all.
Bye.
Take care. Good night.